Esteemed political commentator, historian and editor-at-large of The Australian, Paul Kelly, has issued a warning about net zero. Writing in today's Australian, Kelly says rejecting net zero would condemn the Liberals to electoral oblivion, claiming the response to the 2025 defeat is to run harder against climate action is unforgivable folly and tactical madness, Kelly writes. Labor would add climate denial to Medicare as its fail-safe mechanisms to ensure the coalition stayed in opposition in perpetuity. And Kelly points out Labor would get plenty of support from the full progressive orchestra with Teals, Greens, the women's vote, the youth vote, the unions, the corporates, the finance sector, the NGOs, the education lobby and the full progressive media all slipping into their moralistic outrage mode. This is a tough political issue for the coalition, all right, and for the country. But is Kelly right? Let me bring in Tom Switzer from the Centre for Independent Studies. Good to talk to you, Tom. What's your view of this warning?
Well, Paul Kelly is undoubtedly our nation's most experienced and distinguished commentator, and he has been for the past half century, going back to the Whitlam era. But even Paul sometimes makes imperfect calls. I mean, this net zero fracas, Chris, reminds me a lot of the debate over the ETS in 2009. And the media mantra back then, Laurie Oakes, Michelle Grattan, Lenore Taylor, Laura Tingle, and yes, Paul Kelly, their argument was that Liberal opposition to the ETS, Kevin Rudd's ETS, would lead to electoral annihilation. They were Paul's words. And that's what he said in 2009. And then by December 2009, Tony Abbott knocked off your old boss, Chris Malcolm Turnbull, right? And Tony Abbott became the leader, and he subjected the government to a lot of scrutiny. Rudd imploded, and he ultimately ended the signature legislation, the emissions trading scheme. So the lesson here is that if you subject government policy to real scrutiny and raise the issue of the costs, and remember, decarbonising the economy is not a cost-free exercise, then I think there is political dividends to be paid. Now, it is true in those metropolitan electorates, it is difficult. I don't think the coalition wants to reject renewables completely, but at the same time, it's all about the pace of change, not to its importance of reducing our carbon footprint. So I think ultimately it makes sense to question the conventional wisdom in Canberra.
Look, you're absolutely right. And of course, as you say, Chief of Staff to Malcolm Turnbull in that year of living dangerously of 2009, I had inside running on all of this. I know those arguments. I wear the battle scars, but there was very much a view that if you opposed the carbon pollution reduction scheme that Rudd called it, you would consign yourself to opposition. But instead, Rudd backed down. Rudd and Wong pulled their ETS, and Tony Abbott went on to really win the 2010 election, but claim it properly in 2013. So the point here is it's not an either or, is it? You can't just say scrap net zero by 2050 and do nothing. The coalition would need to say, A, they're going to do something to give us affordable, reliable electricity and have a longer term, more viable plan to look after the environment and reduce emissions, surely.
Well, I mean, meanwhile, what's happened here is that the government will significantly miss its 82% renewables target by 2030. And that's from Ross Garnaut, who is the godfather of climate change and an enthusiast for renewable energy. And we shouldn't be surprised. Again, as I said to you last week, look around the world. The latest statistical review of world energy records that last year, 2020-24, the world burned more coal, gas and oil, the fossil fuels, than in any previous year. And more than 80% of the world's energy demand is still met by fossil fuels. Wind and solar account for 5 to 10%, if that. So put the Australian debate in a global context and you'll realise that scrutiny of the government's net zero policy is bound to pay political and economic policy dividends.
I think that's right. If you put the right policy out there, then the events and the facts are going to bolster your argument over time. You've got to make it well. I don't think the coalition have run any arguments well over the past few years, except perhaps their opposition to The Voice. as the exception that proves the rule. But my argument is, I would say that the coalition, the right of centre, should really be all about what works, what's pragmatic and what works, rather than getting bogged down in any ideology, whereas the left are on this ideological crusade to save the planet. So the point here is that current technology cannot deliver net zero and is bound to create a lot of energy cost and upheaval in the process. So what the coalition needs to do is outline that fact, the fact that we're running into trouble, and put up a practical measure that is an alternative. Now, nuclear is part of that. And as you say, renewables are here. They're not going to go away, but you need to keep them as a reasonable share of the energy grid, and then use other technologies like gas and nuclear to make sure we've got sufficient and reliable supplies.
But also hold the advocates of net zero energy to account. And their lodestar here is Germany and the European Union. Germany has invested so many hundreds of billions of euros in its green energy transition over many years. And no one can really name the precise amount of how much they've put into the energy transition. Yet the share of wind and solar power in Germany's energy mix is declining dramatically. And there's no surprises why. It's because the months when they don't do well with wind and solar, those months are usually wind-free, onshore and offshore. So if the coalition highlighted what's happening around even the enthusiastic countries for net zero and point out that they're having problems, then it shouldn't be too difficult to point out the risks and consequences of net zero here in Australia, Chris.
Yeah, you're right. Apart from Germany, you can look at Spain, you can look at California. There are plenty of examples. Chickens are coming home to roost. Thanks for joining us, Tom. I appreciate it. I love it when you remind everybody I work for Turnbull. We do it every week. Tom Switzer there from the Centre for Independent Studies.